Okay, and you already touched on this a little bit that you worked in a little bit in construction where you try to keep yourself above, where you try to pay your bills, right? While you were learning programming and other jobs like dishwashing that people would not consider fun most of the time. And from your blog, I also read that you have some experience with bad mind states. You had phases of depression in this time when you were declined from university, right? So maybe you can talk about this a little bit. How do you cope with these bad mind states and how do you avoid them?
So, just to give a bit of context and introduction to that, sort of the depression and those sorts of things. So, I grew up in an environment where the people who raised me didn't have adequate coping mechanisms to deal with their emotional problems, substance abuse, and just really unhealthy emotions, essentially. I actually moved out when I was 17, 2 months after high school, and I basically had to relearn these things for myself. So, depression and sort of a lack of productivity as a result of that has been a recurring theme in my life. Now, fortunately, through YouTube primarily and the internet in general, I've been able to sort of absorb a lot of useful information uh, from my various mentors and then apply it in my own life. So, sort of the good news is that it's much less of a problem than it used to be. And I'm going to try and share a few things which hopefully people can use and apply because ironically, this is actually something that I get asked about quite a lot in my live stream Q&As because I think depression and motivation and productivity, these things are all kind of intertwined. So, the first thing that I suggest, this is what I do for myself, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I can fix other people's problems. You'll see some people on YouTube that purport to do that, and to be honest, they're either lying to you or they're trying to sell you something, or they're self-deluded. But what I can share with you is the things that I've used over the span of about 7 years to try and deal with my own problems. And one thing that might make me a little bit uniquely useful in explaining this is that I'm a very, very obsessively minded person. So these are things that I think about every day. And pretty much my primary concern for almost the last decade has been how do I get my work done when I want to do it? And a lot of that has come down to sort of cultivating healthier emotions. So this is a huge topic. So I've tried to sort of boil this down into three main things that this would be like if someone came to me on the Q&A or something like that asking about depression or productivity, the things that I personally focus on. So the first thing that I suggest people look at is to ask yourself, is my depression, my bad emotional state, my lack of productivity, is it a mechanical problem, which is my way of saying, is it a physical problem? So I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. We can later if we have time and if Florian wants to go into a little more detail on these things, but just really quickly, we're talking about like, what does your diet look like? What does your sleep look like? Do you exercise? Do you meditate or do yoga or do something to sort of calm your mind down? So obviously these sort of physical things and the mental things are intertwined. But one thing I would look for is if you feel really good on a certain day and then the next day you feel bad and it's kind of up and down like that, I would suggest either contacting your doctor and getting blood tests done to see if you have nutrient deficiencies or just generally take a look at your diet and your lifestyle and try and evaluate it from there. So the second thing I suggest to look at, and there's a lot to that first point. I'm kind of covering it in 60 seconds, but things you can apply sort of immediately. The first thing that I suggest you think about, or the second thing is, do you have some kind of goal? Obviously not a groundbreaking idea here, but let me give you a quick example. I actually applied for a job at the sort of the end of August. I didn't end up getting the job. And so prior to that job, I had this job I was preparing for about a number of months. And so it was very easy for me to motivate myself to do things like learning Russian and studying compiler development and stuff like that. So when you have some kind of goal, obviously it's easier to motivate yourself, especially if there's a deadline. Now, immediately after that, I had no particular goal and no particular deadline. And of course, my productivity started to dip. I probably would have gotten depressed years ago, but my life is a lot better right now and I have better coping mechanisms. But there was about a week where I wasn't really getting a lot of work done. I had stopped studying languages. I'd kind of stopped working on my compiler development. So what do you do? Sometimes life will sort of uproot your plans, or sometimes it'll give you opportunities, but sometimes having a specific goal isn't really possible. It's great when it's there, but this is one of the most important things that I've learned, and I've really tried to apply this in my life recently, and I think it's quite useful. So if you have a goal if you have a goal, great. Let's assume you've taken care of your health, you're a relatively healthy person. You're still not getting your work done. I think at that point, what people need to really think about is what I like to call structure, or for my computer science nerds out there, scheduling policy, which comes from CPU studies, but some kind of structure. So this could include, you're going to have to play around with this. I've played around with these things for years, so I know what kind of works for me, but having like a daily to-do list might be something. Having a rough schedule, having a highly specific schedule where you pencil in almost every minute of your time, having some kind of structure in your life. This is incredibly important because if you're able to follow that structure, that's actually going to give you good emotions, and you have to actually consciously sort of encourage yourself to have these good emotions. So my experience has been having a structure can become your goal in absence of like a bigger goal. And that's how lately, for the past several years, I've been able to be just a lot more productive, even when I'm either feeling pretty lost or kind of feeling down, or just life's throwing a bunch of crap at me. Now, there's one very, very important thing you need to do regarding this structure. Two things, actually. So, for starters, and this ties back into what I was talking about with it being a mechanical problem. Over the span of days, weeks, months, etc., you need to think about everything you did yesterday or the day before or a week before, which made you feel bad today, which made you lethargic, so low energy, which messed up your mental focus, or just gave you brain fog, these sorts of things. You also need to consider things that you did yesterday or the day before or this morning or whatever that contribute to having a clear mind, lots of energy physically, lots of focus. And you need to really perform that analysis. So when you're creating your structure, you really need to factor those things into account. Now, the second really important thing to do, and this is a tough one for people who used to be really productive. I've had periods of my life where I was working 8 hours a day, 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, pretty much with no days off. When you've had the experience of being super productive, you can really kind of overshoot this and set your expectations way too high after a depression or after life kicks you in the nuts, basically. So what you need to do in this particular case is, with your structure, start very, very simply. Start with an hour a day. Start with a half hour a day, depending on what you're doing. And like I said before, even if it almost seems ridiculous to do so, if you get your hour of coding done per day, you have to give yourself positive feedback. You can't say to yourself, I could have done a lot more. You have to say, I did this. So start slow with something that you could do, maybe not on your worst day, but on a bad day. And just do that for a week, for like 5 days. And then after a certain number of days, you can bump things up. If on a given day you feel like doing more, that's fine. Just don't get into that thing where like, okay, my original goal was 1 hour. Today I killed it. I did 5 hours. I'm going to do 5 hours tomorrow, because then you're probably going to set yourself up for failure and then get depressed. So sometimes with certain things, I'll deliberately just do the hour and I won't go overhead and just make myself comfortable with that particular thing. So just to review really quickly, the three things that I really think about when it comes to productivity and depression and these sorts of things. So number one, getting your health in order. Eat your vegetables. I feel like your mom or something, but just if you're feeling crappy, there's a pretty high chance that you have something wrong in your lifestyle, your diet, or something like that. Because my baseline mental sort of chemistry is pretty negative, I have to work out most days of the week. I have to eat healthy. I have to meditate. These things are not optional for me. And hopefully that's not the case with you, but it might be. Having a goal is great. Obviously, sometimes you just don't have anything obvious. If you don't have a goal, I actually suggest you not to worry about it too much. Just actually be patient. Because sometimes life will ruin your plans and sometimes it will give you something better than what your plan already was. So just be patient. And in absence of a goal, you have to give yourself some kind of structure. That's what works for me.
So diet, exercise, sleep, those are things that many people just ignore. They know that they should do it, but they often still ignore it because maybe they're too lazy or they don't want to go through the work of getting rid of bad habits. But yeah, it can't be emphasized enough how important it is to exercise regularly, to eat properly, and to sleep enough to avoid stuff like depression and be more motivated in general. Now, I know that there are certain kinds of depression that are really illnesses that you can't simply avoid by doing exercise. But for many people, they will feel a lot better if they just build good habits. So this is something people should not avoid.
It's also, just really quickly, it's worth mentioning, I do know people who sleep like 4 hours a day and eat nothing but processed carbs, and they're geniuses. Don't compare yourself to those people, but they are out there, I admit it.
Yeah, for some people that works, but for 99.999%, it probably doesn't work like this.
Not for me.
Yeah, for me neither. And you quickly, or you touched on the topic, or you touched on the idea of having a schedule, which is interesting because I've also been on a schedule that I imposed on myself for the last 2 weeks. And it works wonders for me in terms of having a proper structure in my day and being motivated to do my stuff and do my work. And I've tried this before, and then sometimes I stopped using it. But when I have a real schedule, then I'm always much more productive. And I'm also much more happier because, and this is especially important for someone who is self-employed, who is responsible for his whole day, because I don't have anyone who looks at me 8 hours of the day and makes sure that I'm actually working. So I'm responsible for structuring my whole day, and I'm much more satisfied and happy when I have a schedule, because not only because I get more done, but also because I have fixed times where I take breaks. And then I can take these breaks without feeling guilty for not working right now. When I don't have a schedule, this often happens. Then I take a break and then I immediately feel guilty. Or maybe I should be working right now. Maybe the break is too long. But when I have but it's a bit dependent on your personal preferences and on your genetics, I think, because I know that a schedule doesn't work for everyone. For me, it works. If my calendar says 8 a.m. you start working, then I actually start working. Then I really have this motivation to start working at this time. And then I take the break when it's time for a break. So there's something in my head that really likes the structure, and I really have an easy time following it, but I know that it's not for everyone. But also what I like about a schedule is that you start focusing on putting in the time and the work instead of always looking at the end goal. Because if you always look at the end goal, then every obstacle along the way discourages you. Every time you have a problem, that you don't understand something or that something doesn't work, can be really frustrating and demotivating if you just focus on the end goal, like becoming job ready as a programmer, for example, then every time you don't understand something, it's frustration basically. But if you have something like a schedule or a time-based approach where you focus or where you just try to put in the hours, quality hours of learning time, then these little blocks of time become your intermediate goal. This is what you focus on. On any given day, I just focus on following the schedule as good as possible and making sure that it's quality time that I put in there. And this way, it's just easier for me to stay motivated because I have a feeling of satisfaction whenever I finished something in my schedule, whenever I finished a time block. I hope this makes sense, but it definitely works for me.
I'd love to actually riff on that for a second. I think that's a really wonderful point. And I saw a tweet you had made about debugging, if I recall correctly. And it was debugging an issue which wasn't like a coding error. It was just some ridiculous... remind me what the issue was.
I had no special example, but what I was basically saying is that especially beginners, they often say, oh, I had this bug and I tried to figure it out and I needed 2 hours to fix this bug. And then they say, those were 2 hours wasted, but this is not wasted time. You learned something.
Yeah, exactly. That's so important. And what you said about, like, the way I think about it, when you have that schedule, a really important thing to do, as you said, is putting the time in, not solving the problem, is your reward. And that can be a weird little mental shift for people who grow up with a lot of guilt, like most Westerners, apparently. But that is such an important mental shift. Like, it's not that I'm not... So let's say, for example, it takes you 2 weeks to solve a problem. Then probably, Florian, you've had the same experience of getting stuck on one single problem for 2 weeks, is probably in the beginning of your career. For me, the longest I ever had was one problem for 3 weeks. It's very easy to get demoralized and to basically be unhappy for those 3 weeks. And then finally you solve the problem, or maybe you gave up, but finally you solve the problem and then you get to feel good. No, that's not how it should work. If you put the time in, then based on your structure, then you say to yourself, I feel good. I put the effort in. That way, even if it takes you 3 weeks, every day you feel good because you put the time in. So that's such a great point.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly how I feel. And I also like the schedule because it simply shows me where my time goes. And at the end of the day, I have a feeling for exactly how much I've done, how much rest I've taken. And as you already said, the point is not to overshoot all the time and try to do as much as possible and cram as much work in. You can start small and you don't have to put a ton of work into your schedule. It's just about focusing on what you put in on any given day and not so much on the final result, because this never ends. There's always something new to learn. There are always new problems that are coming up. And if this is always just an obstacle, then you will be endlessly unhappy in your whole career, because there is no moment when you say, okay, now I have learned everything and I have solved the last problem and now I can be happier. This is the same in work and in life, basically. So you need to find a way to focus more on the moment or on any given day in itself. Yeah, and when I've followed my schedule for a day, then I feel very satisfied.
Yeah, sometimes for me, I'll still have that guilt creep in, and then I can be like, nope, I followed the schedule. I'm good. Those negative habits pop into your mind, and so...
Yeah, this is thoughts like this are also why meditation is important. I've noted this down for later, but if there's time, we should talk about meditation a bit more at a later point, because I know that 99% of the people watching this don't care at all about meditation, so I don't want to bore them. I'd rather put it more towards the end.
Yeah.
Okay, one more thing I want to mention is that if someone talked you into learning programming, or if you did it for the money, then you should, and you just hate it, then you should consider doing something else. Because today it's very easy to switch careers and do something else and teach you something else. So if there are people watching this that really never enjoy programming at all, and for which it always feels like a chore, then they should switch careers as early as possible. And I also started learning to code at 27, so really late. Or it's actually not even that late yet. I would still, now at 31, I would still switch careers if I noticed that I hated programming. Because you actually don't need that long to become somewhat sufficient in a topic if you enjoy it. Because if you enjoy it, then it turns into play for you, and then you just naturally learn better and faster and are more motivated. But yeah, even I think programming is the closest to a passion what I can find in my life. I think it's naturally interesting to me, but I still don't find it easy, and I still don't find it easy to stay motivated every day. So this is completely normal. One more thing that people on Twitter have wondered about: you live in a real rural area, right? Or don't you live there anymore? I always thought you live in the forest.
Yeah, in a wooden box.
Yes.
Okay, so it's a bit of a long story. So I grew up on a tiny island. Like literally there was, when I was born, about 1,800 people on it. You could walk across the island sort of widthwise in probably about an hour, although lengthwise it was pretty long. It's this beautiful rural forested area with some mountains in the BC coast, so the west coast of Canada, where I'm from. So I had moved there sort of at the start of the pandemic. I think that was like, I want to say like March 2020. And I was there for over a year. And so I remember someone, I think Don Felker actually had asked about what the benefits of that are. So the great thing about living in sort of the middle of nowhere is that, let's say, for example, I sit at my computer for like 4 hours and I need to get up and go and take a walk. I can get up and go and take a walk in this beautiful nature. Like there was literally 80 acres of nature in a beautiful climate to walk around in. I grew up in that forest. Wandering around there was basically what I spent half my childhood doing. The other half was probably playing Elder Scrolls games. So it's a place where I can go into and I feel at home and just feel very calm. So if you have the opportunity to live in a rural area, particularly one with a good climate, I think that's a really important thing. I think it's a wonderful thing, especially if you like nature. And so the story is, so the place is still there and I can go back, relatively speaking, anytime I want. Basically what happened is I met a girl who was worth moving to Alberta for. She unfortunately, so she's a medical resident, a doctor, but sort of when you become a doctor in Canada right after med school, you still have residency. So you have to do that for like usually 2 to 5 years, depending on your program. She actually tried to relocate to BC, where I was, but unfortunately she wasn't able to do that. So I had basically the choice of staying in my rural area, which I had internet and stuff like that, but I wasn't exactly like living in luxury. It's rural living. Also, the power kept going out and stuff like that. These are the things you deal with in a rural area. I had that choice, or I could move to basically a city, get an apartment, and live with her. And she has totally been worth it. So hopefully we'll still end up there eventually, because I'm used to city living. I've lived in a city. I lived in cities since I was 17, but my heart really is in the on the fields and in the forests. And so that's basically, in a perfect world, we would be still living out there. But here I am in downtown Calgary, a nice part of it, so I have nothing to complain about.
Yeah, I don't know if you've already said this, but does it help with your mental state to live there? I can read between the lines that it does.
Absolutely, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. Part of it is being surrounded by nature. Assume you're similar to me, is very peaceful. It's just beautiful surroundings. I think part of it honestly has to do with maybe like there's more oxygen in the air when you're just surrounded by trees and foliage. There's something about taking a 20-minute walk in a forest that just calms you right down has been my experience. Maybe it's also a bit of a psychological thing from my childhood. That was my happy place. But yeah, it did wonders for my mental state. And on a certain level, you're going to experience, it's going to be boring. It's going to be slow paced. But the benefit is if you can still have a good mindset, it's going to be a very peaceful existence, which is, if you can calm your mind down enough, that's honestly priceless.